So this is the talk that you all signed up for, and I will try to make sense of lots of things according to that title. It might be a stretch in most places, but we'll see. So I figured in a design presentation, I should start with a very designy quote from Charles Eames. This idea that eventually everything connecting is key, it's important, it's probably super relevant, but I like this point about the quality of the connections, which I think works really well when we think about like connecting with people. I think about that quality of connections. Some additional context for this. These are sort of like thoughts that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of this whole idea of thinking about people and connecting with people and how we design for that. But also I like it to be kind of broadly spoken, that it's not only accessible to the design world. So I've had conversations about this with people, and a lot of references are pointed to like human-centered design, these types of things, but I feel like that's so industry focused and not for everybody. So I've been thinking a lot about like, how can it be for everybody? So in the absence of being able to actually meet together, which of course would be better and not burn out everybody on Zoom, but I'd like to have 3 conversations today, kind of based on this idea of opportunity for experience and connecting with people. These are 3 kind of areas that I think a lot about, that are sort of surrounding my own methodology, but this idea of process of discovery, radical empathy, and then a practice for living. I've broken up my talk into those areas so that I will pause kind of after each one. So we might be able to have a conversation if you're interested. We'll see how that goes. If you're not comfortable doing that, that's totally fine. But so much of this, what I'm going to share with you, is drawn from conversations that I have constantly, kind of related to my practice and related to teaching. And so getting that feedback and getting other people's perspectives is really important to my own process. So that's how we're going to structure things today. But to give you some context, I should probably actually introduce myself. There's obviously people on this call who I know already, but I will give a little bit of a background. So this, I run a studio practice called Station with my wife and partner Amanda, and I wrote this a while back, imagining like, if we ever had a podcast or something, this would be like a really great introduction, which is super cheesy, I suppose, when I say it out loud, but I love it anyway. So background on me, I'm a traditionally trained graphic designer. I went to Yale for my MFA in design. I spent 8 years in the Army. I teach as an assistant professor of graphic design and director of graduate studies up at Boston University. So that's in addition to running the studio practice with Amanda. Amanda is in fact a scientist and worked for 10 plus years in biotech before deciding to stay home after our second kid was born. We have 3. And that's at the same time that I started teaching and decided to start Station as a practice. I wasn't very good at running my own studio, and that's when Amanda leaned in and said, this isn't working, so like, let's fix this. And she did that and realized that she could never leave then. But I think we had this kind of realization that the work that she was doing in science actually wasn't that different than what we did in design. So that the way that we thought about things, the way that we looked at things strategically was really very similar. So that's just a little bit of background on like where we kind of stand. And more of that will become relevant as we go. So we're constantly thinking about the work that we do, how much it's intertwined with our lives actually, and how it can be meaningful for us and our family. we recognize this is a tremendous privilege to even be able to say and do this. So we want to make sure we're doing right by that. This is a talk from Aaron Draplin, who you may know. He gave at Boston University in 2016, I think. And he had this slide, which I took a picture of, but do good work for good people. This does exist, really. And we always think about that, right? Like you always, I mean, maybe everybody says this, but we try really hard to hold true to that, and to find our way into that and into that thinking, which is why we're constantly kind of reflecting on and analyzing what it is we're actually doing. So some of our work has kind of brought us into conversations, obviously, with people who are not designers. In fact, that's really intentional. We've been nearly constantly engaged in these kinds of conversations for years, including this is part of a research project that we're working on. We were trying to think about, it's initially focused on learning insights from chefs and how we could infuse that into design. And we evolved that into a much broader concept of creating meaningful opportunities to connect with people. And this name might sound familiar to you in Rhode Island. This is Pat McNiff, who runs Pat's Pasture, his own farm and food truck. And we just had this alignment on like this idea of just trying to make things better and like constantly reflecting on processes and, again, like doing good work for good people in that sense, but still like applied to farming and food and not just in design. And this is sort of spanned, like this is kind of a handful of people we had conversations with about this somewhat topic of meaningful human connection. And every time we have a conversation, we fine tune how we talk about it. So you all right now are participating in probably 3.0 version of this conversation that we're trying to figure out. But as you can see, like some of this was really kind of rooted in our food and chef project, but it started to get much broader than that, and realizing that we're looking at other people who interface with people on a regular basis. Like how does their work practice constantly put them in the intersection of or connection with people? So the origin story here, though, for me, is not actually rooted in design or science or food, but is deeply rooted in human connection and experience. So about 18 years ago, I found myself in Iraq as a sergeant in the Army Reserves, doing, for the most part, humanitarian aid type of work. I was young and I didn't want to be there, but I was immersed in what would be one of the most culturally transformative moments of my life. Of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but the many hours we spent like literally breaking bread and having conversation with an incredible range of people cultivated this deep empathy, humility, and respect within me. So there's this quote from the former reverend or pastor at my church. I'm not a heavily sort of religious or spiritual person. We went to this church, and Reverend Dr. Bill Trench is very professorial, and so going there was like going to a lecture, and I was really kind of captivated by the way that he talked about things and about people. But he said this at the beginning of basically every sermon: the journeys that have brought us to this place are as varied and as different as the people who gather here, which I always loved this statement as something that felt full of possibility. It's like this welcome invitation through the acknowledgement that we come together wherever and however we, with distinctly unique perspectives on life. And as a designer, I've always thought of this as like my filter of perspective with which I view design, and more broadly the world, but we all have a filter of perspective, and it's important to fully acknowledge and openly accept that. So I started, while I was making this work, I was thinking a lot about this like design myth that there's like never any new ideas. Like you're just kind of redoing something that's already been done, which I think is always funny and kind of interesting. And but I was looking up for like, what is the source of that? Like, where did that come from? Or what is the actual design quote? Because I only knew it from stories, right? And I actually came across this Mark Twain quote, which is the same thing, just not design specific. But I still liked it. This idea, like we simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into sort of a mental kaleidoscope, and give them a turn, and they make new and curious combinations. And that does feel like design or design ideas or a design process to me. So I felt this was pretty relevant in this case. So let's start with an old idea, a manifesto. Designers love a good manifesto, but this one felt different. It stuck with me for years. Daniel Etok, if you don't know of him, makes uniquely simple, like quirky work that feels like cultural observation, or subtle commentary on pretentiousness of art and design. Or maybe I'm projecting that onto his work, but this manifesto feels like a conscious effort to move towards a language that is simple and clear and accessible. In graphic design, we pride ourselves on communication, but sometimes we forget this part, this use of language, and we sink deep into the depths of like inaccessible jargon. A slight shift, different entry points become opportunities to pass through your filter of perspective. It can be a matter of connecting with a person or not. The key there perhaps is the idea of an opportunity. So this particular image is one of my favorite pieces of photography. It's called Things Are Queer by Dwayne Michaels. And I've always loved that every image within this set is an entry point, but when you start in one place and end in another, you actually have a different perspective on the whole thing just by shifting where you're at. And so just as a metaphor for lots of my interest in design, this has always been particularly relevant to me. So back to the idea of three conversations on borrowed perspectives, some old and some new. So conversation one, calling process of discovery. So I got my master's degree in graphic design at Yale, I said before, and the development of the thesis and design there at the time was to develop a body of work around a methodology. I defined my methodology as discovery and design, a two-way street in which designer and people I'm designing for experience a process of discovery through the work that is using the and that using this concept was an ideal way to communicate with people in new, surprising and meaningful ways. This particular statement is lifted literally from my designer statement in grad school. It's still relevant to me today. Like, it's interesting to me that long ago, I came up with this idea about design and wrote about it and did research about it, created a body of work, but it's still really important to my methodology today. And I think that it's still pretty relevant to this idea of connecting with people. So while I was in grad school, one of my advisors said this to me, not in like a negative way, but I think you're naively optimistic about the intelligence of your audience. And I loved it at the moment. And it was like something I wanted to embrace, and still to this day, again, like want to wear this as like a badge of honor, right? Like, it's what that means to me is that back then I was making my work in a way that I felt like was respectful of anybody that came in, that I didn't make any real assumptions. I just made the work and experimented with trying to give people opportunities to come into that work. So still true today. Naive optimism, I think, is actually really important to this idea of discovery. And I think like positive and meaningful connections with people. So there's a blogger that I read all the time, Jason Kotke, who's been blogging for, you may know, but he's been blogging for like 30 years. People talk in a precious way about genius, creativity, and curiosity as superpowers that people are born with, but noticing is a more humble pursuit. Noticing is something we can all do. And again, I love that statement just in relation to this idea of making opportunities for human connection accessible to people. What if it's more of a humble pursuit? And so this idea of like noticing the world around you and paying attention to those things, that's a process of discovery, but it's also important if you actually want to make meaningful connections with people. So something from last year, but still very present in our minds, is this huge cultural moment. And this, not only from last year, but it sort of came to this pinnacle last year, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the fence that was erected around the White House became this place for people who had something to say, to share what they wanted to say about this. And Michael Beirut, at the time, who's a designer partner at Pentagram in New York, tweeted about this, called it the most important graphic design exhibition in years. And I thought that was really interesting, but as a moment of discovery or a moment to connect with people, like this to me is a further, like it's a cycle of discovery, like this natural and organic coming together of people who had something to say, but also the exchange with people who arrived just to kind of witness and learn from this. And I think these are all, again, like moments of discovery, and they're opportunities to connect. And that sometimes things like that are designed, and sometimes things like that are natural, and we need to kind of notice and be aware of these things and learn from these moments. I'm going to share a quick video. This is something that some of you may be familiar with, but I love it. It's always like really great to watch every time. This is by a group called Improv Everywhere, and this is a particular project they did called Say Something Nice.
Have a good day, everybody. You are all wonderful.
Welcome back to New York, Candace.
I love everybody that is out here. I love you all. Yes!
Hey, you with the umbrella! The blue umbrella! Oh, I really like it! It's pretty! We're from Dallas, Texas, and we love New York! Come on now! Ariana, Mommy loves you. I love you. Happy birthday! Thank you! Happy birthday! Thank you!
My leather jacket, my leather jacket, my leather jacket. I hope everyone has a nice day.
What a beautiful day! Have a great day, everyone. Have a nice one. Turning 50 is as bad as they said it would be.
Fill it up and let it overflow. Fill it up and let it overflow.
So I love this project. It's open-ended. There's no expectations really. So it's like the statement from the former pastor of my church that I showed you. It's like this welcome invitation through the acknowledgement that we come together wherever and however with distinctly unique perspectives on life, and also the humility that you might just learn something from another person. So I just love that sentiment. So each of these three conversations is sort of supported in a way by insights or, again, creative perspectives that I've borrowed from other people. In the spirit of no idea is new, I'm just kind of like assembling these things from all different places and putting them together in one place. That like the mental kaleidoscope from the Mark Twain quote. So the first one is opportunity for experience. So this one actually is borrowed from somebody that I can no longer remember. I read it about 10 years ago. I was preparing for a class I was teaching called Experience Design. It was on a blog, like a frog design blog. And I can't remember who wrote it, and I can no longer find the thing anymore. So this is as much of a credit as I can give, that it came from somebody from frog design at the time. But it's this idea that we don't design experiences, we create opportunities for experiences. And I think, like, returning to my earlier point about nuance and the language that we use, this shift here is important. Once you start saying that in your head, you look at the work differently. You can imagine outcomes differently. You think about the audience of your work differently. And I think this applies to most things when it comes to connection. So I know this idea isn't original or even new, but it's always stuck with me. And while it's not original or new, I think it can be part of a broader methodology of finding more meaningful connections with people. I have multiple conversations about this idea of discovery and then opportunities for experience and connecting with people with a friend of mine, an architect in California who designs spatial experiences. His name's Chris Corbett. And this quote, everything could be a potential adventure, or every object could have some sort or be a magical portal onto something. This desire to have more immersive experiences really resonated with me. It really connected with this idea of designing or creating opportunities for experience, that like open door, that sort of welcome invitation for people to come into. I met Chris while I was at Yale, but from there he went on to work with Disney Imagineers for a while before starting his own practice. So I think some of this sentiment comes from that, from this like this thinking of things being immersive or magical in some way, because of his work at Disney. But that's just something that is true to his values, and I think is actually really important, again, to consider, like, how can you use these kinds of ideas to create more meaningful experiences with other people. Somewhat along those lines, and to keep bringing back this idea of food, because I can't help myself, but I keep returning to this project called Bad Taste, or Bad Taste is the organization more than a project, I suppose, but it's Jen Monroe's project committed to exploring new ways of thinking about food and consumption, approaching food as fantasy and as a transportive medium. And I see this as something that hits on my original ideas about discovery and design, that the process of creating is discovery, and the people on the other side of the work discover something through the experience. But in particular, by creating sort of unconventional meals, as what Bad Taste is doing, allows for people, it gives them an opportunity to experience something new or experiencing a new idea. The images here are from a particular dinner that they did, where all of the food was an exploration on what happens 50 years from now because of climate change. Like, we have to, like, salt is more prevalent in the water, and we're eating more seaweed or different kinds of organisms. And so they made entire dishes around this idea of climate change 50 years from now. So it was this sort of learning opportunity for everybody, in addition to being a dining experience. It's just kind of like really nice example of like a gift to people. So from there, we move, sticking with the environmental theme, we move into this idea of seeing potential instead of problems. And this is from Don Danby and David McConville. So Don and David run a studio called Spherical, based in Oakland. And their work is focused deeply on planet health and regenerative ecosystems. And as you might imagine, like sometimes this work of talking in any way about climate change and science can be overwhelming. So they mentioned to me in conversation one time that they had this personal shift from seeing things as problems that needed solving to a more positive perspective of seeing the potential in things and the opportunities to engage. And I love this shift, and I've embraced it, now in my own practice. And when I'm teaching that, I believe we should be seeking to find potential improvements, and not because something is wrong, but because we want to make things better. And this is, again, that like shift in wording and nuance, because as designers, we're always saying like, we're problem solvers and that's what design is. But that feels so heavy and negative sometimes to me, that it's like we're just seeking all the problems in the world, and I would prefer to look at as the potential to make things better. So this is a very local story that many of you likely know if you've been to the restaurant Big King to eat. But as the story goes, James Mark had ordered custom, beautiful made plates and dishes from a local ceramicist. And in the process of the glazing the dishware, many batches in the collection cracked and broke into pieces in the kiln. And James, with his own humility, and I can imagine not wanting to just throw away beautiful work, saw this as an opportunity, not a problem. So if you go and eat there, which you should, your meal will very likely be served on beautiful partial sections of plates. And if you didn't know the story and you went in there, it's like this surprising experience when your food is served on a half broken plate. It's kind of beautiful. It's kind of, fits really well with the food. And but this whole idea of like seeing the potential in that and not a problem is one of those stories that kind of like sticks with you. So I think this idea is related to, or the idea of embracing perfection, or the beauty of imperfection, and seeing that as potential and not a problem is at least part of these Japanese concepts of wabi-sabi and kintsugi. So this is a project called Literally Bawling by artist Victor Salomon, in which he fixed up rundown basketball court, repairing the blacktop using the Japanese art of kintsugi. Traditionally, kintsugi method involves repairing pottery with glue mixed with gold powder, which results in visible cracks as a reminder of the pottery's past and what it's been through. Says Solomon of the project, with the heartbreaking beginning to 2020 and this weekend's return of basketball, I've been thinking about the parallels between sport as a uniting platform to inspire healing and my ongoing experiments with the technique of kintsugi that embellishes an object's repair with gold to celebrate its healing as a formative part of the journey. So reflection, embracing imperfection, seeing things as opportunities, not seeing a past story as problematic in any way, but as just something that's a formative part of the journey is super important. And that's very human. And I think that that's another thing, like we're paying attention to these things, if we're noticing these things in the world, if we're embracing these things as part of the way that we create or make or engage with people, that it becomes a way to make these more meaningful connections with people. So the next one is Beware the Single Story. So this is actually literally the name of a TED Talk that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie gave at, it's quite a while back now, probably 7 or 8 years maybe. But I think really important, especially in the context of design. But she talked about this idea of the single story, and then that we are all unique and have traveled unique paths and carry unique stories. And this single story is that this assumption that everybody is one way, or that there are large groups of people that act in some way, or this idea that you can like generalize people. And I think even when we have shared culture or experience, it's important to acknowledge, embrace, and further celebrate the differences, the many stories. So going a bit further back, this is something that I discovered when I was in grad school, but it's an art project by Gillian Waring called Signs That Say What You Want Them to Say, and Not Signs That Say What Someone Else Wants You to Say. And she stopped hundreds of passerby in London, invited them to write whatever they wished on a white card, and photographed them. Like all of Waring's work, the portraits in the series convey the startling, unsettling divide between one's outside appearance and innermost self. But I thought this was interestingly relevant in the context of Beware the Single Story, because it means that, or it's related because we don't want to make the assumptions about people just on one thing that we might know about them, or the way that they appear to us, but that everybody has this sort of like unique and powerful background and has a unique perspective, and that we should be trying to elevate that and embrace it or celebrate it in some way. Further connected to that, there's a designer based in San Francisco named Mike Montero, who's been pretty outspoken about many of the problems in the world actually being caused by designers. And he has a design, like principles of design ethics in this book called Ruined by Design. And one of them talks about this idea of, related to Beware the Single Story, which is there's no edge cases. And that for so long in the design world and the product design world in particular, like that if it didn't fit into our audience framework, people were referred to as edge cases. And he brings up the point that like that is marginalizing people, that is turning people into data, that is suddenly like people aren't people anymore when you start thinking about those things. So they're not edge cases, they're human beings, and we owe them our best work is like such brilliant sentiment. And it relates back to that idea of like do good work for good people. Like just it's not data, they are not generalized audience anymore, and we need to be paying attention to these things. So this next one's also a video, but to give a little context to the video, I discovered this project called Stalled through a story on 99% Invisible podcast. First half of the podcast was actually a personal story of reporter Sandy Allen, a non-binary and transgender person, and their dilemma of using restrooms when away from home. Sandy's story laid out all of the complexities of even the idea of public restrooms, and by extension, system of code and regulation around restrooms, major systems of spaces driven by a single story, or at the very least excluding using the terrible language of edge cases.
Stalled takes current controversies about transgender access to public bathrooms as a point of departure to address the design consequences of creating safe, inclusive restrooms for everyone, irrespective of age, gender, religion, and disability.
This is not the first time that bathrooms have become an issue. At different moments in US history, the public bathroom has registered social anxieties triggered by the threat of previously marginalized groups moving into mainstream society. Milestones include the creation of the ladies' room as more women entered the paid workforce in the 1880s, the fight to abolish colored bathrooms during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, the fear of being infected with HIV by sharing restrooms with gay men during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, and the disability rights movement's demand for accessible restrooms that led to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. The transgender bathroom debates is just the latest episode in this long history. Both sides frame the issue as a matter of safety, a opponents falsely characterize trans women as predatory men, masquerading in dresses to stalk women and girls in the ladies' room, while trans advocates point to statistics that show how trans people, trans women of color in particular, are the likelier victims of restroom violence. What's threatening about trans people is that they call into question the idea that one's gender is determined by anatomy. Trans, non-binary, intersex, and other gender non-conforming people demonstrate that there are many ways of expressing one's gender independent from biological sex that don't conform to the binary of sex-segregated bathrooms.
The most common approach to the all-gender restroom is the single-user solution. This consists of a single-occupancy, ADA-compliant bathroom labeled gender-neutral. This approach stigmatizes not only trans and gender nonconforming people, but also people with disabilities by separating them from others. Stalled advocates an alternative, the multi-user solution, which treats the restroom as a single open space, replacing the typical stalls whose revealing gaps compromise privacy with floor-to-ceiling partitions and communal areas for washing and grooming. We've developed a process for retrofitting sex-segregated restrooms that takes the multi-user approach a step further. First, we remove the plumbing stack wall and treat the bathroom as one open space. We then eliminate the corridor wall, treating the bathroom as a porous extension of the hallway. We add 3 different types of fully enclosed stalls, standard, ambulatory, and ADA, as well as caregiving rooms, which include sinks and changing tables. We add communal grooming and washing stations off the circulation path, and finally a lounge that transforms the corridor into an animated social space. This solution has 3 advantages. Restroom users can visually monitor one another, reducing the risk of violence. Gender nonconforming people aren't stuck between 2 options that don't align with their identities. And it meets the needs of the trans community, as well as a wide range of differently embodied people, including caregivers, the elderly, mothers, Muslims, and people with disabilities. Stalled has also developed a prototype for high-traffic spaces like airports that reimagine the restroom as an open precinct animated by 3 activity zones: grooming, washing, and eliminating. We're promoting inclusive restrooms through 3 initiatives. We've compiled our research into an open source website accessible to designers, students, cultural institutions, and municipalities. Stalled team member Terry Kogan is spearheading our initiative to amend the International Plumbing Code to make the multi-user solution code compliant. And through lectures, workshops, and publications, we're raising awareness that bathrooms are but one example of the need to create inclusive public spaces that allow a broad range of people to productively mix. To learn more about Stalled,
So I just think this example is an interesting example of not generalizing or singularizing, but also in questioning the definition of even like what is a restroom, or questioning the regulations surrounding these kinds of things. Like this is actually, even this concept is kind of getting blocked because of code regulations, because code are very, very explicitly state what a restroom is and should be. And I think this is in some ways a project meant to question that as a systemic problem. So the last one in this section, this is work by Jen White Johnson, and her work explores the erasure of Black disabled children in digital and literary media. The visuals she makes using photo and design are her own reflections that amplify conversations with the disability community. It ignites the continued need to develop anti-racist, anti-ableist media. So while we need to seek to move beyond the single story and understand and elevate the multiple stories, Jen White Johnson is actively seeking to tell the hidden, discarded, or invisible stories through her own perspective and personal experience. So I'm going to pause for a minute and stop sharing, and just kind of open it up for conversation. So what we just talked about, I mean, obviously there's a big introduction to that, but this is all under this bucket of this process of discovery. And within the process of discovery, I talked about, beware of the single story, and I talked about potential versus problem, and I talked about opportunities for experience. So I'm gonna like look in the, I saw chats coming in and I can't control them while I'm in present mode. So
Yeah, can I jump in with a question?
yeah, absolutely.
So you shared such great, compelling examples. I was curious to hear how just one of those examples might play into some of your own process.
I think that there's a couple different ways for me. Part of that is in sort of my teaching world, and the way that I teach or like to teach. This idea of opportunity for experience to me is that, or even discovery for that matter in general, as a professor, is about it being a two-way street, about really trying to lean in and lean towards the students to learn from them as well as whatever I'm teaching. So it's more like I share experience and they share experience. I don't like the dynamic of professor versus student, and that I know more than you and that you don't. So that's one example, but it's also related to the work that we do, which very often right now is like strategy work, where we're helping organizations kind of imagine a new vision or articulate the vision of their organization, whether they're mission or values based or whatever. So the work that we do is very relationship based, because we believe in these things. We believe in this process of discovery. It means our projects take longer usually because we're spending a lot more time with the people, that we're not like, bidding jobs based on hours. We want to work with people. We want to get to know them. We want to have and establish a relationship with them so that we can help them together advance whatever it is they're working on. So help them do their best work. In order to do that, you have to have a meaningful connection with people. And that, all of these things are very relevant, that we see things as the potential to grow or the potential to learn or the potential to do better in every project that we engage in right now. And that's why it's relationship based. We kind of like throw ourselves into the work. Does that help? I guess it's like not a very specific example, but it's like slightly more specific.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Everyone, please feel free to go off mute if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. The comments that came in the chat were appreciation for that Mark Twain quote. And I was really interested and inspired by that history of bathrooms and how it has affected disadvantaged groups over time.
That one, the whole story around that from the 99% Invisible podcast was really fascinating and really interesting. And I know I learned a lot, but it caused me to stop and really consider like this is about redefining everything. And you can see it's actually like a really interesting example of like when you want to point to people and talk about systemic discrimination. Like it's so clear there. It's like, no, this is actually just written into the code that we're not accepting everybody, that you either fit in one of these buckets or it doesn't matter. So I think that alone, just as an example of something that could be addressed or could be thought about, is really interesting to me.
Yeah, it looks like Amanda has a comment. Amanda, do you want to unmute?
I'm a little bit in a construction zone right now, so it's it's kind of noisy off and on in the background. But as someone, as a scientist previously, and then, working in design now, and just inherently in how I operate as a person, I'm often focused on problem solving. Even in my personal life, like my kids come home and right away I'm like, oh, that, you're upset. Let's kind of figure out a solution together. And sometimes, I really love this potential over the problem, because I've even been reflecting, like often you need to listen to somebody and not go right into problem solving mode, to sit there there's that moment for connecting in a different way when you just leave space to imagine that potential, and live in that moment. So that's something that is challenging which is always good for growth. And I think it's a really important part that we need to incorporate into design more and more.
That's such a good
Thank you for that.
observation. I wonder, does anyone else in the audience have a good example of a time when they tried to listen instead of going directly into that problem solving?
All right. I can jump back in if nobody has anything else. But thank you for the comments, because it helps, I think, add more context to what I'm talking about.
Nick,
Yes.
how do you imagine we make opportunities for systems to listen?
It's a really good question. I wonder if in some ways, like the stalled example asks that question of systems, that in many ways it's not like pointing directly, it's not trying to solve a system or regulation, but it's sort of coming with a new or refreshed approach. It's a lot about, let's rethink the question, or maybe we're asking the wrong question. So it's like challenging the fact that like maybe this was the wrong thing to begin with. Like maybe the system, the entire system is wrong. Like, does there need to be a new system altogether? And I think that like the stalled example works in that way, because it says like maybe calling these things restrooms or whatever is the wrong thing in the first place. Like, what is this space in the first place? And if there's a different kind of space, then it's a different kind of system or regulation altogether. I had this conversation talking about like an organization's values and their mission and their vision. It was a school, and they talked about where they wanted to be, and we identified and codified all those things, their values and their mission, everything was tied neatly together. And then people within the organization started questioning those and saying, but this isn't who we are right now. And we suggested that, right, but it's where you want to be. And so maybe that needs to be kind of held out there as a standard that you need to adhere to. And they said, well, like the way that professional evaluations are done don't fit what we're saying here. And I said, well, maybe you need to redefine how you do professional evaluations. And so we had that flipped conversation of like, can the question be different so that you're asking about different parts of your system, or you're setting aspirations for a system and then you're making yourselves actually catch up with those goals and aspirations.
Thank you.
What's amazing to me about that question is that it makes me rethink, like usually I think of having to listen to the system or seeing what the system is doing. And it sort of suggests that an intervention into a system, that we might actually be able to see the system listening as it reacts. And that it sort of makes both makes a space for thinking about the design as the speaking or the intervention as speaking, and then having to listen to the conversation that comes from that to try to understand then actually what the system's really doing, or I don't know, seeing how it reacts so that then you can figure out the next part of the conversation. That's I'm never really, thank you for the framing of that question.
Yeah, it's really good. And you totally like put us on the spot there. Yeah. But I love that. Okay, I'm gonna bring up this next conversation. I also realized that this is going already longer than I thought because I didn't rehearse it in the first place. So we might only get through 2 conversations, in which case that's totally fine because I think it's super interesting. And so thank you all for chiming in here. Second conversation is sort of entitling radical empathy. So fairly recently, Jose Andres, who's a chef and founder of World Central Kitchen, which we'll talk more about actually later, said this quote about empathy, and I love this in every possible way. But what we've been able to do is weaponize empathy. Without empathy, nothing works. And so that's really specific to the context of what he's doing with World Central Kitchen, where basically they're getting meals to people in need in like disaster areas anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. And it's that moment, like without empathy, nothing works. And I think that that's so relevant to this idea of like, if you want to have meaningful connections with people, like it doesn't work without empathy. And this is again from my research project, talking to chefs previously, thinking about being an interconnected community, and understanding and being part of that connection means making any contribution that creates impact in some way. It's kind of just like a really important thing, a principle that I think about a lot. The thing about being a designer is that we need to remember that there's always someone, a person, a human being on the other side of whatever it is we do. We have to start there from the smallest scale and try to understand the perspective of each one of those people as best we can, and understand that that person in the context of a community of people. So to kind of continue this connection from where we closed out with Jen White Johnson's work, this diagram, which is from the publication Extra Bold, Feminist, Inclusive, Anti-Racist, Non-Binary Field Guide for Graphic Designers. Jennifer Tobias discusses intersectionality. And she says, imagine many streets intersecting: gender, race, class, religion, ability, age, and so on. And each street has multiple lanes because many identities are possible within each category. Indeed, this fictional intersection could have an enormous number of streets divided into countless lanes. And this, I think, connects to the beware the single story. And I think that, you know, for years, people haven't paid attention to this idea of intersectionality, but it's like super important, obviously, as a designer. But I think just as a human, this needs to be more common language. It needs to be more regularized, standardized. It needs to be part of like our own accessible language, and not just kind of out there as a term that people in certain industries pay attention to. And so I really loved this diagram because I feel like it's entirely accessible. Like this brings the concept down to anybody who wants to engage with it, and just like reading through this, like makes sense of something that's actually not that complex of a topic to understand, but I feel like people do have a hard time understanding it. So seeing it in this way, I think like really helps. And it helps when we think of radical empathy, of like really trying to understand and connect with the humanness of other people. So next borrowed perspective is from Chris Ying. So Chris Ying's a writer and editor formerly of the food magazine Lucky Peach, and now leads the media arm of Momofuku Restaurant Empire. The media organization is called Major Domo. And he pulled together a book of essays entitled You and I Eat the Same. The title as a hypothesis of sorts built on the idea that cuisine cannot exist without the free and fair movement of ingredients, ideas, and people. And he writes, after reading what the contributors had to say about the ways food links us together, I feel distinctly closer to people. I listened to an interview between chef Dave Chang, who started the Momofuku restaurant empire, and Adam Grant, who's a psychologist specializing in organizational psychology. And this may come as no surprise, but sharing an experience or engaging in exchange with authenticity, honesty, and transparency create deeper and more lasting connections. And that comes from specifically from Adam Grant's research about organizations, but obviously relevant coming from, as a question from Dave Chang about like sharing meals with people and sharing food with people specifically. But shared experience can do so much in terms of creating those meaningful connections. There's an organization called Illegal Art, and they create participatory installations in order to engage the general public in shared experience. In this particular example, they invited people to write their fears on the sidewalk in chalk and then literally wash them away as a sort of shared catharsis, creating meaningful human connections with other people participating, whether you knew them or not. Going back in time a bit, this Everybody mural was created by Tibor Kalman and Scott Stoll in Times Square in the early 90s. They covered a large billboard on the Police Information Center in Times Square with the word everybody. Like a one-word poem, it could refer to the multitudes who come to or pass through Times Square. It could also suggest that somehow Times Square is a symbol of the world's people at a crossroads, maybe in need of redevelopment. Several chairs are mounted above the platform at the base of the sign, hopefully to be used by anybody for a rest, to take a picture, or to observe everybody passing by. And then a more recent of, I think, this same theme of everybody. There's a couple examples of work by Candy Chang. And Candy Chang just creates rituals that uncover the complexity of our inner lives. So the project Before I Die reimagines how the walls of our cities can help us grapple with mortality and meaning as a community today. Over 5,000 Before I Die walls have been created by communities in over 75 countries to date. And The Atlantic called it one of the most creative community projects ever. And then this other project on the right, Monument for the Anxious and Hopeful, is a living catalog of the ways in which we relate to the uncertainty of tomorrow. People were invited to anonymously share their anxieties and hopes on vellum cards and hang them on the collective wall, where visitors could explore thousands of individual meditations that range from personal, local, and specific statements to political, theoretical, and spiritual reflections. So this is Candy Chang's thing, this idea of like engaging the public of in like a shared experience, and this sort of you and I eat the same model. It's sort of putting everybody at this level playing field and asking them to participate in this. And I've seen a lot of these kinds of projects through my own students at BU over the years, of like wanting to and seeking a way to let anybody kind of come into the work and participate in the work and leave their mark in the work. And it's a really beautiful thing to see it happen. I think people, especially if it can be anonymous, people tend to want to participate in these things. And it's this two-way street again, similarly to my ideas about discovery and design, but that you can participate, you put your own thing there, but you also get to read what other people are saying. So this is also kind of in the line of the more organic installation of the Black Lives Matter protests, but it's a way to have shared ideas, shared like humanity with other people who you likely don't know. Next insight, be present, local, and humble, or stay grounded in scale. So this is borrowed from Mark Brand. And this is the idea, like, look at what is right there in front of you and consider your own personal meditation on what's in front of you, what's local that you can work on or work towards. Consider where the immediate and close connections can happen. So I'm going to play another short video, which is a clip from a longer talk that Mark Brand gave at TEDx in Vancouver. But to give some context, if you don't know who he is, really specifically, he took over like a old restaurant, diner, butcher shop in Vancouver called Save On Meats. And it was in what many consider not a great part of town in Vancouver. And he had a goal of helping people, feeding people, like no judgment, just the idea that these people outside of my store are humans and they need help and they are my neighbors. Let's start there. So one of the things that he implemented, for example, was this token system where people could hand out a token to somebody who they thought might be in need of getting something to eat, and that person could take the token in and get a meal. And again, these things are no questions asked, and it was meant to have like no stigma associated, like everybody paid with tokens. And if you were somebody who wanted to help, but you felt weird about it, about like giving money or giving food, you could just hand out these tokens and they could be redeemed, but everybody used them. And so it kind of like levels that playing field. And they've done a number of other charitable things recently, but I just liked that as a moment for it was about helping people in need, and it was also about helping people who wanted to help. So it's kind of this like two-pronged approach.
I've lost friends, the most important person in my life, and had to rebuild because the level that I took my own brain and exhaustion to literally almost killed me. I changed nothing. And I tell you, there is nothing more invigorating than understanding how flawed you are and still believing that you can do good. I'll leave you with one story. We talk about barrier employment, and what that means is people with barriers. We employ people who are addicted to heroin right now because they need a step somewhere. In 2007, I was leaving my house. It was freezing cold, one of our rare snowy days. And if any of you have been in the neighborhood, there's a guy that is affectionately described as Football Mike. Football Mike essentially looks exactly like Mick Jagger, but can do way more push-ups than him, and cleans the streets. And he always looked pretty put together. And at one point, I saw him, he looked completely disheveled. So we have this conversation. I finally cracked the ice, and I walk to him. I say, "Hey, man, are you okay?" And he's like, "No, I'm not." He didn't speak to anyone. It's like, "Can we talk about what your situation is?" Michael suffers from Asperger's syndrome and also is a heroin addict and crack cocaine addict. Human being. He had to leave a single room occupancy because of his syndrome. He couldn't cope with the fact that there was bed bugs everywhere. Can you imagine that? Being like that detail oriented and that freaked out by dirt and then having bed bugs. So he left the SRO and went back to it to collect his belongings, and they had incinerated everything. All of his clothing, non-issue. All of his family photos. And that struck a chord with me. It's like, this is unacceptable. What do we do to fix you? You can't fix somebody, you can only give them a leg up. Mike and I went for a beer, and we discussed the situation. We got him housing stabilized with great partners of ours. And Mike has worked for me 7 days a week, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. He works on my hours every single day. And we couldn't do what we do without him. The reason the streets are so clean in front of my establishments, Mike Haggerty. Best dude out. But nobody else would give him a shot. The solutions that we see and are conventional aren't necessarily a solution at all. Think outside the box. Enrich your neighborhood. Just do the right thing. Thank you.
So this idea of enrich the neighborhood, do the right thing is particularly significant. This idea of being grounded in scale, I think everybody not everybody, plenty of designers want to go and like solve the, like the world's problems. And again, we go back to this like problem solving thing. But it's always some big kind of lofty thing, instead of there could be a thing right in front of you that you can make a difference and actually have an impact, and see the thing immediately and be kind of humble about that. And that could grow much bigger, but start there, like start local. So along those lines, this just happened a couple weeks ago. So Jasmine Crowe is the CEO of the Gooder Company, and the Gooder Company is actually focused on the elimination of food waste and redistribution of food resources. But they partnered with this hip hop star Gunna to create a free in-school supermarket. And the idea is that you can just make reservations, whether you're a student or the student's family, and you can come in and shop there and it's free. And everybody has reusable shopping bags that goes to the school, so that everybody's carrying them around. So there's no stigma associated with like, oh, I just went and shopped at the free grocery store because I'm in need of these things. And so they opened this, and it's fully supported by hip hop star Gunna, who went to this school and wanted to give back to his own community. And he's committed to funding the project for as long as he's alive. And I think like this idea, this unconventional idea of meeting people where they're at and trying something that's a little bit different or unexpected, like putting a free grocery store inside of school where there's many kids that go home, like their only meal happens in school. So what happens when they're outside of school? So considering what people's life experiences might be. Additionally, they were thinking about what are things that are sort of quick and easy to prepare, because in some of these cases, students go home and they are actually the ones cooking the meal for a family or for younger siblings. And so it was all about thinking about that close to home, small scale thing. What are these immediate, like what is the neighborhood experience like, and how can we affect or impact that? How can we slow things down and be present and help those people? So one more video. I told you we'd come back to Jose Andres. This is about his organization called World Central Kitchen.
We have one mission: let's feed the people in need.
World Central Kitchen is on the ground in Nassau, just 90 miles from the eye of the storm.
We show up, boots on the ground, and we start feeding people. And in the process, the plan shows up. That's who we are. And we do it with the community. We do it with locals. We empower the local reconstruction as we keep feeding people.
Here we are with more than 40 small farmers that we are giving grants.
One day they will have a very big percentage of the foods they consume produced right here in the island. We're about ideas and putting them into action.
After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, Andres has wanted to do more to help create a new kind of activism.
Jose Andres has been thinking about innovative ways to feed people for decades. These free meals are delivered to military personnel working in a makeshift hospital.
When you talk about food and water, people don't want a solution 1 week from now, 1 month from now. The solution has to be now. You began taking care of people, the reconstruction begins much earlier. Food relief cannot be about check. A plate of food for us is a way to have a contract with the communities. We come and we tell them, here we are, and we'll come back tomorrow and the day after, until you are okay. Whatever there is a fight so hungry people may eat, we will be there.
So this organization is really quite incredible. He said it in that video, but the idea that they show up and they start feeding people, and then a plan comes together. That flipping of things, that prioritization, that like get to the people first, and we'll figure the rest out later, is the opposite of most bureaucratic organizations. So it's immediate. And if you've seen anything in the news of like some tragic thing happening, by the time you've heard it on the news, they're already there, which is some weird superhero thing that they're able to do. But they're on the ground everywhere all the time, anytime something happens. And it's really quite incredible, but it's all about people. The way that they work is all about being local. And so everybody who's cooking those meals there are not, shipped in from somewhere else on an airplane. It's local people who know how to cook, and they get them cooking, and then they get everybody back up and running, and it's really, really, really beautiful. So last part of this conversation, we're leaping into my borrowed insight from Jose Andres. So witnessing impact. We often have conversations around impact when I'm working with clients. And these conversations often become about measurement and data. The push toward the data can sometimes lead to a disconnect between the made things and the people experiencing the impact, wherein the people become data and we only see them as data, and we lose sight of the intentions. So what if instead of a focus on measuring impact, we spent more time witnessing impact, when you can see and feel meaningful connections with others? So this is a project called Commuter Therapy by Alice Donovan, and she's a former grad student of mine at BU. And she shaped her thesis work around connecting meaning and impact through design, and had set out to develop a body of work at this intersection. It was 2013, I think, and we had experienced a series of major snowstorms in the region. As I'm sure many of you recall, in Boston, it was a complete disaster, partially because they ran out of places to put the snow. But many of the subway lines run above ground, and we're experiencing huge problems as a result. Alice noticed that everyone commuting, particularly in public transit, was miserable and grumpy, more than usual, which is surprising for Boston. So she designed replica T passes, or tickets, and printed them with statements of positivity and hope, and cut to look like actual tickets. So she passed them out to people at train stations and at stops. And you could literally see people's faces and demeanor transform. Like they would be kind of angry, or you'd hand them a ticket and they would look at it and then change immediately. So while not measurable, like you can witness the impact. And if it changed just one person's day, isn't that still impact? So imagine also if that one person whose day you changed, you made them smile, you made them happy for a moment, you disrupted their mood in some way, in a positive way. Imagine that that person leaves there, and then they hold the door for the next person behind them, which maybe they wouldn't have before that. And then that's that like chain reaction. You can't measure those things, but you can witness it. You can know that that's happening. You can kind of see the impact happening. And I think that we forget about that sometimes, that that's actually a really important thing to be doing. Last part, we're almost at time. So I'm going to end after this video. Instead of going on to conversation 3, I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time. But I feel like everybody needs to see this video too. So this is a organization called Restaurant of Mistaken Orders, and they set out to, it's a Japanese organization. They set out to use food and dining to transform basically the public stigma and relationship with people who have dementia.
世界的にも認知症っていうのは誤解されてるところがあるのかなというふうに思うんですけれども、認知症になったら何もできなくなってしまう。で、時に社会から認知症が隔離されてしまう。そうじゃなくって認知症の人たちと一緒に普通の暮らしができる、そういった寛容な社会を作りたいというふうに思ってました。
We opened a limited period pop-up restaurant where all the waiting staff are dementia patients. And what did we call ourselves?
もうちゃんの、あ、そっちだ。ごめんなさい、これ。あ、これ。気
取って忘れるんやけど、ごめんなさいね。
ご注文の、なんだっけ。言えないですよね。
やっぱおしゃれでお料理がすごく美味しく、でもその結果間違えてしまったら笑ってごめんねって全然いいですよって言える、そういうコミュニケーションが一番大事。看板を掲げることで間違えてもまあいいかっていう認知症があってもなくても心はとても軽くなる、ハッピーな空気が生まれたんじゃないかなって。
間違えてもなんかユーモラスですごい感動しました。
注文間違えるレストランがあってもいいじゃないか。
誰にでもある普通のことなんだというふうに受け止められれば全く問題なく関係を結べるんだな。
Companies have taken notice and want to participate.
この料理店の中で起きたことが社会全体に広まったら誰もが生きやすい社会になるんじゃないかなって思います。
So I'll close out there. I feel like it's kind of a nice note to end on. This whole concept of, for all people involved, it could be transformative, that people involved in this who have dementia might have an opportunity to regain pride or dignity. And I think that the people who are guests at the restaurant can have a moment of humility and respect, and then there's joy in between that, and that this shared experience can help everybody kind of move away from this stigma that, like, you know, people with this condition need to be kind of hidden away, and that the people who have that are feeling like they're losing something. So it was able to be like this multi-level experience, and again, kind of a process for everybody to be involved in. So we're super close to time, and I just want to thank everybody for letting me run through this and for joining me for this. It's like kind of talk that I didn't practice ahead of time, that I didn't know how long it was going to go, but I wanted to pull all these sentiments together and these thoughts, because it's something that we think a lot about in our studio and when I'm teaching. So yeah, if anybody has questions or comments, I'm here if you need to run. Thanks again for coming.